Hey, we're tackling something that honestly pops up everywhere, from like self-help books to serious medical diagnoses. It's this gap, this huge space between just plain old common sense, the kind of stuff your grandmother knew instinctively, and the very formal, very technical language that academics love to use, especially in areas like behavioral science.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? We're really looking at conceptual rebranding. You hit on something key there, is idea that a lot of the modern psychological or economic terms, they really do feel like old stuff in new age words.
Hmm.
Our mission today is to kind of pull back the curtain on that. How does this renaming happen? Why bother giving a fancy name to a simple proverb? And crucially, what are the real world impacts? Because it's not just academic word games. It fuels industries. It changes how people get diagnosed. It really matters.
That's exactly it. The connection between the theory and, well, real life. We want to get how these ideas get repackaged, but also what happens when this kind of subjective, maybe even engineered idea of truth runs smack into the legal system, because the law needs some kind of solid ground, right? It needs a working definition of reality to keep things running.
Absolutely. So here's the plan. We'll start with something we're calling the grandmother test, a way to strip off the jargon. Then we'll dive into some really popular concepts like the Dunning-Kruger effect and ask, well, are they actually solid? Or just good stories? We'll look at the money trail, too, how financial incentives can literally inflate diagnoses, things like social anxiety disorder or adult ADHD. And finally, we'll get a bit philosophical, exploring how bendy actual reality might be and contrast that with the very practical, very structured idea of formal legal truth.
Okay, sounds like a journey. Let's start at the beginning. Why does common sense need a scientific makeover in the first place? What's the driving force behind giving everything a technical label?
All right, let's get into the engine room, which is often academia. The basic idea is that fields like behavioral economics, social psychology, they build their credibility, their whole domain really, by formally discovering these cognitive biases or psychological effects. But if you look closely, a lot of these discoveries, they look an awful lot like folk wisdom, like sayings and observations people have passed down for ages.
And it's not always about finding deeper truth, is it? It sounds like sometimes it's more about, well, getting published, getting grants, giving something a formal sciencey name. That nominalization you mentioned, it adds that crucial veneer of scientific objectivity. Without the fancier term, maybe it just sounds like advice, not research.
That's a huge part of it. It's the currency conversion.
Hmm.
You take an observation everyone kind of knows, you give it a technical term, suddenly it's measurable, citable, fundable, it's scientific capital.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the grandmother test. It's dead simple, really. You take this big academic concept, explain it in plain English to your grandmother or, anyone outside the field, and if they raise an eyebrow and say, oh, honey, we've got a saying for that already, bingo, you've probably found folk wisdom dressed up in academic robes.
I love that. Okay, let's put it to work. Where should we start? Behavioral economics seems like a good place. It's had such a massive impact.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Let's take the sunk cost fallacy. The academic definition is something like a greater tendency to continue an endeavor once an investment in money, effort, or time has been made, even if it's clearly a bad idea to keep going.
Right, sticking with something just because you've already put so much into it.
Yeah. Yeah, what would Grandma say?
Don't throw good money after bad. Simple as that.
Exactly. It's the same core idea. Ancient wisdom about getting trapped, emotionally or financially. They even gave it another name sometimes, the Concorde fallacy.
Oh, right, because the British and French governments kept pouring money into the Concorde jet long after it stopped making any economic sense.
Precisely. The sunk costs the money. The national pride were just too high to walk away. They kept throwing good money after bad prestige. The academic term analyzes it, but the basic human error, universally understood.
Okay, what's next on the behavioral econ list? How about loss aversion? That's a big one from prospect theory.
Huge one. The core idea is that the psychological pain of losing something is roughly twice as powerful as the pleasure you get from gaining the equivalent thing. That 2-to-1 ratio is pretty specific in their models.
So losing $100 feels twice as bad as finding $100 feels good.
That's the claim. Now run the grandmother test. What saying captures that feeling, that calculation of risk versus reward?
Maybe. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush.
Perfect. That captures it beautifully, doesn't it? It's about valuing the sure thing, the thing you have, much more than the potential uncertain bigger gain. The academics put a number on it, gave it the fancy name, but the gut feeling, the human tendency, it's right there in the proverb.
Okay, one more from this area. Anchoring bias. The tendency to rely too heavily on the very first piece of information you get, the anchor. when you're making decisions later on.
Yeah, this pops up everywhere. Price negotiations, first offers, even medical diagnosis heavily colors everything that follows.
And the folk wisdom version.
It's simply the power of a first impression, right? We all know that initial information sets the stage, frames the whole conversation or judgment. The academic work tested it, quantified it, gave it the label, but the core insight, old news.
It's really striking when you lay it out like that. The renaming seems almost industrial. Does the same pattern hold true in social psychology, too? Shifting from money to how people behave.
Oh, absolutely. Maybe even more so sometimes. Consider the bystander effect. Famous theory, right? Individuals are less likely to help someone in an emergency if there are other people around. Responsibility gets diffused.
Yeah, everyone assumes someone else will step in.
And what's the raw, maybe less charitable way of describing that decision?
Just don't get involved. Keep your head down.
Exactly. The theory gives it a scientific
Yeah.
gloss. Diffusion of responsibility sounds very objective.
Mm-hmm.
But often it's just a description of people choosing self-preservation or apathy in a crowd. We've known people do that forever.
Okay, how about growth mindset? That's huge in education circles. The idea that your abilities aren't fixed, that you can develop intelligence through hard work.
What does that sound like?
Practice makes perfect.
Precisely. Rebranded for the modern classroom. Maybe with a bit more psychological framing, but the core message.
Yeah.
Ancient. And very marketable for consultants, of course.
And one more that feels very current. Imposter syndrome. That feeling of being a fraud, doubting your accomplishments, fearing you'll be found out, even when you're successful. So many people talk about this.
Yeah, it resonates strongly, especially with high achievers.
Yeah.
But before it got the formal label, what was it? It was probably understood as, humility, maybe intense self-criticism, or just the anxiety that comes with setting incredibly high standards for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Giving it the name imposter syndrome does something important, though. It codifies it. It turns that private feeling of inadequacy into something, well, diagnosable, discussable, something you can write articles about, give talks on, offer coaching for. It legitimizes the feeling, but also packages it.
So the grandmother test seems pretty effective. It consistently shows this pattern. Take common observation, apply formal label, gain scientific or professional leverage.
That's the core mechanism. Nominalization is power. Okay, so some of these rebranded concepts like loss aversion or anchoring, they actually hold up pretty well when you test them rigorously. They describe real, measurable biases, even if the core idea was known beforehand. But, and this is a big but, there's a whole other category of these rebranded ideas. These are the ones that get incredibly popular, quoted everywhere, become part of the cultural lexicon, not because they're empirically solid, but because they tell a really compelling story. They achieve what the sources call citation momentum based on narrative appeal, and sometimes they get completely disconnected from the actual scientific truth.
Ah, the great decoupling you mentioned earlier, where the catchiness of the idea matters more than whether it's actually, true. And I bet I know the poster child for this phenomenon. It has to be the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Everyone loves that one.
It's the undisputed champion. It's just too perfect a story. Let's run the grandmother test again. What's the folk wisdom equivalent?
Probably. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Or maybe a bit harsher. Too stupid to know they're stupid.
Exactly. The academic version is that incompetent people don't just perform poorly. They lack the very metacognitive ability to realize they're performing poorly. So they massively overestimate their own skills. The incompetent are blissfully unaware of their incompetence. It's ironic. It's satisfying. It confirms our biases about certain people. It's irresistible.
It feels so right, doesn't it? We've all encountered someone who fits that description perfectly. Supremely confident, yet demonstrably clueless.
We absolutely have. But here's where the critique gets really sharp. The sources argue that this compelling narrative might be masking something much more mundane, that the Dunning-Kruger pattern isn't some unique psychological deficit at all. Instead, it might just be a statistical artifact, a ghost in the data. Specifically, a rebranding of regression toward the mean.
Regression toward the mean. Okay, refresh my memory on that one. That's when extreme results tend to move closer to the average on subsequent measurements.
You give people a test, say, logic puzzles. Then you ask them to rate how well they think they did. You've got two variables, actual score and self-assessed score. These two things are related, obviously, but not perfectly. There's noise, error, imperfect self-awareness. Now, if you plot these two imperfectly correlated variables, regression toward the mean guarantees you will see a pattern that looks like Dunning-Kruger.
How does that work? Why is it guaranteed?
Think about the people who scored lowest, say, the bottom 10%. Just by random chance and the limits of self-assessment, where can their self-rating go? Mostly upright. It's hard to score in the bottom 10% and also rate yourself in the bottom 10%. Even if they think they did poorly, they'll likely rate themselves higher than their actual rock bottom score, just moving closer to the average self-assessment. Now flip it. The top 10% performers, they ace the test. But when they rate themselves, they have to allow for the possibility they missed something, or maybe they aren't that much better than everyone else. So their self-assessment tends to be a bit lower than their stellar score, again, regressing towards the average self-assessment.
So, the pattern low performers overestimating, high performers underestimating it, just falls out of the statistics when you compare two measures that aren't perfectly aligned.
That's the core of the critique. It's like a statistical illusion created by the way we plot the data. The really damaging part of the Dunning-Kruger story is the claim of a unique metacognitive deficit, that the lowest performers are fundamentally incapable of seeing their incompetence. But some analyses looking at the raw data found the relationship between actual ability and self-assessed ability is, well, pretty much just a straight line. It's essentially linear.
Yeah.
People generally do have a rough idea of where they stand.
Wait, if the relationship is linear, that completely blows up the Dunning-Kruger narrative, doesn't it? The whole point was that the bottom group was specifically diluted in a way others weren't.
It fundamentally challenges it, yes. The argument is that by framing this statistical pattern as a psychological syndrome, Dunning and Kruger created a much more compelling, publishable, and ultimately viral brand. The catchy story obscured the more boring, nuanced, statistical reality.
Wow, okay, so Dunning-Kruger might be built on statistical quicksand. Are there other really popular concepts like this, ones that feel true but maybe crumble under scrutiny?
Oh, definitely. Especially ones that get thrown around in business and management circles. Think about the Peter Principle.
Right, people get promoted to their level of incompetence, everyone rises until they hit a job they can't actually do, and then they just stay there. It explains a lot about frustrating bosses.
It feels explanatory, for sure. But where did it come from? Was it based on rigorous organizational research?
I actually don't know.
It came from a book published in 1969 by Lawrence Peter and Raymond Hull. And the crucial thing is, the book presented it as satire. It was intended as a humorous, pseudo-scientific take on corporate life.
You're kidding! It was satire!
Explicitly. The sources call it an unfalsifiable parody. You can't scientifically test it because incompetence is subjective. Any outcome can be explained away. It survives purely on anecdotal resonance. It sounds right. It fits our experiences of bad managers, so we treat it as a scientific principle. Its foundation is literally a joke.
That's kind of amazing. Okay, what about groupthink? That one gets used all the time to explain disasters and bad decisions, like the Challenger explosion or the Bay of Pigs invasion. The idea that pressure for consensus overrides critical thinking.
Another one with huge narrative appeal. It provides a tidy explanation for complex failures. But again, when researchers try to pin it down, try to validate the theory rigorously, it gets really fuzzy. Critics point out there's very little consensus among researchers on its validity. Some even call it no better than a myth. The problem is defining and measuring the key components. What exactly is group cohesion? How do you measure pressure for uniformity? Often, groupthink just becomes a convenient label slapped on after the fact, easier than digging into systemic issues or leadership failures.
So another compelling story that might be diagnostically weak, and this ties back to growth mindset too, right? We said it was basically practice makes perfect, but it spawned this massive industry in schools and businesses. Surely that must have solid evidence behind it, given the money involved.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But when researchers started doing large-scale meta-analyses, trying to replicate the effects, the results were underwhelming, very underwhelming. They found only a small average effect on academic performance. The actual effect size was tiny, like D0.08. In practical terms, that's almost negligible. Many studies found null effects, basically no impact at all. So empirically, it seems quite fragile. But the narrative is powerful, hopeful, and incredibly marketable. The consulting juggernaut keeps rolling, completely decoupled from the shaky empirical base.
This leads to a really uncomfortable question then. If these big ideas, Dunning-Kruger, Peter Principle, maybe even growth mindset to some extent, are flawed or statistically weak, why don't they just die out? We hear about the replication crisis in science.
$1 million question, and it points to a deep systemic issue. We get what the sources call zombie theories. They should be dead, based on the evidence, but they keep shambling on. Why? Because the whole academic incentive structure, The prestige economy rewards the novelty, the initial publication, the catchy rebranding, getting famous for debunking someone else's famous theory. Much harder, much less rewarding. And the evidence for this is stark. Studies actually tracked what happened to the citations of original flawed papers after major failures to replicate them were published.
The citations drop off.
The reduction in citations for the original flawed study did not differ significantly from zero.
Zero. So publishing a refutation has basically no impact on how often the original wrong idea gets cited and spread.
Effectively, yes. The correction is too technical, too boring, lacks the narrative punch of the original zombie theory. The flawed idea is already out there, embedded in textbooks, lectures, popular articles, management training. It's immune to the evidence. The system rewards the brand, not the correction.
Okay, so academic incentives like prestige and publications drive some of this rebranding, but you mentioned earlier that this gets weaponized, really ramped up when major financial incentives enter the picture, specifically in the clinical world, with diagnoses and treatments.
Exactly. Now we shift focus to the direct financial incentive mapping. Here, the argument isn't just about academic credit. It's about market creation and expansion, primarily driven by the pharmaceutical industry. The process is often described as the medicalization of normality. Taking common human experiences, anxieties, or personality traits, rebranding them as formal disorders, and then, crucially, offering a pharmaceutical solution. And the key bureaucratic tool that enables this, according to the sources, is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM. It acts like a cookbook, providing the recipes, the formal criteria, for turning everyday problems into billable diagnoses.
The DSM as a cookbook, that's a provocative image.
Yeah.
And you mentioned diagnostic inflation. The sheer number of diagnoses has exploded over the decades.
Dramatically. The first DSM in 1952 had about 106 disorders. By DSM-IV, it was up to 347. That's a massive expansion. And a lot of that growth comes from lowering thresholds or creating new categories that pathologize things previously considered, well, just part of the normal range of human experience. It gives the whole process a veneer of scientific legitimacy needed for marketing and reimbursement.
Let's look at a specific case. You mentioned the invention model earlier, using social anxiety disorder, SAD, as an example. How did that work?
This is a classic case. SAD is essentially a direct and quite deliberate rebranding of plain old shyness. Before the 1980s, being shy wasn't really seen as a medical condition requiring treatment. Then the DSM criteria started to expand. DSM-IV, for instance, included things like marked fear of social situations where you might be scrutinized, fear of acting in a way that will be embarrassing. Okay, maybe some severe cases fit. But then it also listed examples like embarrassment about eating alone in restaurants or anxiety about talking to authority figures.
Wow, that casts a much wider net. Lots of people feel awkward eating alone or nervous talking to their boss. That doesn't necessarily feel like a disorder.
Exactly. It lowered the bar significantly, potentially pulling millions of normally shy or introverted people under the diagnostic umbrella. And the timing and promotion of this expansion are explicitly linked in the source material to one specific drug, Paxil, made by GlaxoSmithKline.
So this wasn't just identifying an unmet need, it was creating the need.
Yeah.
Disease mongering, as you called it.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
GSK wanted to expand Paxil's market beyond just depression. So they launched massive campaigns to essentially invent shyness as a widespread, serious medical disorder. This involved funding disease awareness initiatives, using things like self-diagnosis quizzes in magazines, heavy PR, hiring celebrity spokespeople, all designed to maximize the detectable prevalence of SA. They weren't just finding patients, they were arguably convincing people they were patients.
They literally created the market for their drug by reframing a common personality trait as an illness.
The sources strongly suggest that yes. Industry publications at the time even praised the campaign, the anxiety market for Paxil. It involved close collaboration with certain medical experts, or thought leaders, who helped shape and promote the diagnostic criteria. It's presented as a clear example of a feedback loop. Pharmaceutical goal, diagnostic redefinition, market creation.
Okay, that's the invention model. What about the expansion model? You used adult ADHD as the example there. That's not inventing something new, but broadening an existing category.
Right. ADHD was already a well-established diagnosis, primarily in children, and the market for stimulant medications was already huge. Think Ritalin, Adderall, and dozens of others. The incentive here wasn't to invent a market, but to dramatically expand the existing, highly lucrative one by making it much easier to diagnose ADHD in adults.
And the mechanism for this expansion was, again, tinkering with the DSM criteria, specifically in the DSM-5 update in 2013.
Exactly. The source material points to specific changes in DSM-5 that seemed almost tailor-made to increase adult diagnoses. Some involved in the process even stated that was a goal.
What were the key changes?
Three main things stand out. First, they raised the age of onset. Symptoms used to have to appear before age 7. They pushed that up to age 12. Suddenly, millions more adults whose symptoms might have emerged a bit later in childhood could qualify. Second, they lowered the symptom threshold for adults. Adults now only needed to meet 5 criteria, down from the 6 required previously and still required for children. Just lowering the bar makes it easier to qualify.
So older onset allowed, fewer symptoms needed.
And third, and maybe most subtly powerful, they recontextualized the symptom examples for adult life. Instead of just talking about interrupting in class or fidgeting, the examples now included things highly relevant to modern adult life, like difficulty organizing tasks and activities, loses things necessary for tasks, or is often easily distracted by extraneous stimuli.
That sounds like. Well, it sounds like a lot of busy, stressed adults in the 21st century. Difficulty organizing, easily distracted.
That's precisely the concern. These revised criteria could easily pathologize normal responses to a demanding, information-saturated life. If you struggled a bit in school before age 12, and now you find it hard to manage your workload and resist checking your phone boom, you might meet the criteria for adult ADHD and be prescribed powerful stimulant medication, potentially for life.
And this expansion isn't just happening abstractly in the DSM manual, it's being solidified through new clinical guidelines and professional organizations.
Absolutely. We now see groups like APSARD, the American Professional Society of ADHD and Related Disorders, publishing the first ever formal U.S. guidelines, specifically for diagnosing and treating adult ADHD. This creates a powerful self-reinforcing cycle. The lucrative drug market incentivizes diagnostic expansion via the DSM revision process. That expansion then justifies creating new specialized guidelines and expert panels. These guidelines, in turn, further legitimize the expanded diagnosis, driving more prescriptions and feeding the market. The whole system risks prioritizing market growth over careful, conservative diagnosis, potentially medicalizing everyday struggles.
This is fascinating and, frankly, a bit disturbing. We've seen how reality can be shaped from the outside by academic labels, by marketing campaigns, but now we need to turn inward. What about the reality inside our own heads? You mentioned earlier this idea that perception itself isn't a clear window onto the world, but something more like a controlled hallucination.
That's a core concept from contemporary neuroscience, yeah. The brain isn't just passively receiving information like a camera, it's locked inside the skull, only getting these, ambiguous electrical signals from the senses. So it has to actively construct its best guess of what's out there. It does this using top-down expectations, its prior beliefs and models about how the world works, and combining them with the incoming sensory data. Normal perception, in this view, is always an act of interpretation of prediction. And the goal isn't necessarily perfect accuracy. It's about creating a stable, useful, continuous narrative that helps us survive and navigate. The brain smooths over gaps, edits out inconsistencies, prioritizes the story over the raw data.
Which sounds remarkably similar to Aldous Huxley's idea decades ago of the brain as a reducing valve, not letting reality in, but actively keeping most of it out.
Exactly. Huxley's insight was profound. He argued the brain and nervous system have to protect us from being completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of potential information and experience out there, what he called mind at large. The reducing valve filters this flood down to just a measly trickle of consciousness, the bits that are biologically useful for survival in our specific environment. We don't perceive all of reality, we perceive the edited highlights reel that helps us find food, avoid danger, and get through the day.
And his experiences with mescaline, described in The Doors of Perception, weren't about seeing things that weren't there, but about seeing ordinary things differently, as if the filter was temporarily removed.
That was the key revelation for him. It wasn't about classic hallucinations of monsters or whatever. It was the transfiguration of objective reality. Mundane objects took on this incredible significance and intensity. He described a simple vase of flowers as a miracle of naked existence. The folds in his trousers were labyrinthine complexity. The legs of a bamboo chair seemed sacramental, supernatural. His brain temporarily stopped editing for mere utility. Instead, it perceived things in terms of their intensity of existence, their profundity of significance. Space and time became irrelevant. It suggests our everyday, stable reality is just one channel, a heavily compressed one, selected for practicality.
Okay, let's connect that to something more technical from the sources. They talk about the effects of DMT, a very potent psychedelic causing digital screens, TVs, phones to look like they're playing in fast forward. Why would that happen?
Likely not just an illusion, but a consequence of the brain literally processing information faster. Think of consciousness having a frame rate, a sampling rate. Normally, it's maybe 10, 15 snapshots or conscious moments per second. DMT seems to dramatically increase this temporal sampling rate, maybe to 30, 40, or even more frames per second. Now, if your brain's sampling rate, let's call it X, becomes faster than the refresh rate of the screen, Y, the content has to appear sped up. You're literally perceiving the individual frames faster than the displays presenting them sequentially.
So you're breaching the critical flicker fusion threshold, the point where separate images normally blend into smooth motion. You're seeing the gaps, effectively.
That's the idea. It's not a trick of the light. It's your internal clock running faster than the external display's clock.
Yeah.
You're accessing sensory data at a higher bandwidth than usual, data that the reducing valve normally smooths over or discards for creating that seamless experience of motion.
That also ties into the other strange effect mentioned. People on DMT are reporting that movies with lots of CGI suddenly look fake, unfinished, seamy, like you can see the digital scaffolding underneath.
Yeah, it's like the brain's usual reality smoothing software gets partially disabled. Normally, your brain uses its top-down predictions, this is a coherent scene, to paper over subtle imperfections or mismatches. It prioritizes the big picture. DMT seems to reduce the precision weighting of priors. It turns down the volume on those top-down expectations and lets more raw sensory data through the filter. So the consciousness might become sensitive enough to detect tiny differences in temporal signatures or reality densities between the live-action footage and the computer-generated elements. It sees the seams, the slight refresh rate mismatches, the underlying raw polygons that your sober brain normally edits out to maintain that illusion of a seamless, unified reality.
So we're constantly living in a simulation generated by our own brains, optimized for function, not fidelity. What happens then when that internal simulation goes badly wrong? When someone's predicted reality completely diverges from the consensus?
Well, that's essentially the definition of psychosis, experiencing a reality profoundly different from the one shared by others. From this predictive processing perspective, psychosis can be understood as a shift in the balance. The brain starts relying too heavily on its internal predictions and downweighting the incoming sensory evidence. The internal model, the controlled hallucination, becomes dominant. This can make bizarre or unlikely things seem perfectly real and reasonable to the individual. Some compare schizophrenia to being stuck in a state like that induced by mescaline. The reducing valve is malfunctioning, letting in too much, or constructing a reality based on faulty priors, making it impossible to distinguish the internal model from external input.
And this individual break from consensus reality can sometimes spread. You mentioned foliata.
Yes, folia do is the clinical term for a shared delusional disorder, where a delusion is transmitted from one person to another, usually someone close. But the sources suggest this concept can scale up, especially in our hyper-connected, media-saturated age, into a kind of cultural folia do. This happens when, say, a powerful group or primary mouthpiece broadcasts a tidy myth, some compelling but distorted narrative. Receptive individuals or groups sync with this narrative, internalize it, and the shared delusion starts to feel like objective truth, maybe even like compassionate scale, mistaken for reality simply because it's widely shared and emotionally resonant.
And this is where artificial intelligence becomes a potential amplifier, the ultimate cybernetician.
That's the concern. AI is becoming incredibly adept at crafting and deploying engineered narratives. It can learn what resonates, what triggers emotional responses, and generate text, images, even video at a scale and speed that humans can't match. It can tailor narratives to specific groups, reinforcing biases, creating echo chambers, and potentially generating these shared realities that feel absolutely solid, even if they're completely detached from verifiable facts. AI absorbs all our digital output, the good, the bad, the ugly, and reflects it back. Optimized for engagement, which often means optimized for division or delusion. It blurs the line between genuine consensus and manufactured reality like never before.
Okay, this brings us full circle back to the legal system. If individual reality is this malleable, this neurochemically constructed, and if collective reality can be influenced by engineered narratives and even mass delusion, how can the law possibly function? It relies on establishing facts, guilt, responsibility. It seems built on foundations we've just shown to be incredibly shaky. This intersubjectivity crisis feels profound.
It is the fundamental challenge for the law. The entire system leans heavily on things like eyewitness testimony. Yet, as we've discussed, perception is private, edited, and unique to each person. Literally, my experience of witnessing an event is neurologically different from yours. My memory encodes it differently, retrieves it differently. When a witness swears to tell the truth, they're swearing to tell their subjective, reconstructed, potentially flawed version of the truth. The court has no direct access to the actual event, only to these imperfect private representations.
So the law has to work with inherently compromised data. It can't verify the actual reality, only the reported reality.
Precisely. And this is why the concept of intersubjectivity becomes so crucial for the law and for society generally. We don't build our shared world by trying to perfectly match up our private internal experiences, my red versus your red. That's impossible. Instead, we build it on shared agreements and shared intentions for functional purposes. We agree that this traffic light color means stop. We don't need to know if we're both experiencing the exact same quality of red. We just need to coordinate our behavior. The law operates on this level of functional agreement, not deep metaphysical alignment.
And the legal system isn't naive about this problem, is it? It knows eyewitness testimony is flawed.
Painfully aware. Decades of research, particularly from organizations like the Innocence Project looking at DNA exonerations, show that eyewitness misidentification is the single leading contributing factor in wrongful convictions. The numbers are staggering, sometimes cited in nearly 80% of those cases. Memory is just incredibly malleable. It can be contaminated by post-event information, by leading questions from investigators, even by the witness's own desire to be helpful. And worse, studies show that a witness's confidence in their memory often has very little correlation with its actual accuracy, but juries tend to equate confidence with correctness. The system knows its star witness is often deeply unreliable.
So given this massive known flaw at its core, why doesn't the whole system just grind to a halt? How does it cope?
It copes through sheer pragmatism. The law basically throws up its hands at the impossible philosophical problem of accessing true, objective, metaphysical reality. It recognizes it can't solve that, so it explicitly rejects the pursuit of substantive truth or metaphysical truth. That's not its job. Its job is to resolve disputes and maintain social order in a reasonably fair and predictable way. To do this, it focuses on achieving formal legal truth, which means what can be proven according to the established rules of evidence and procedure within the confines of the courtroom. It shifts the goal from what really happened out there to what can we reasonably establish happened based on the tested evidence presented here.
So the whole adversarial process, direct examination, cross-examination, rules of evidence, it's not really a perfect machine for finding ultimate truth. It's more like a machine for managing and testing the fallibility of the human input.
That's a great way to put it. It's a pragmatic machine for managing fallibility. The law doesn't blindly trust the witness's subjective certainty. It subjects that certainty, that malleable memory, to rigorous challenge. Cross-examination is designed specifically to probe for inconsistencies, biases, memory gaps, and the influence of external factors. This procedural rigor, the rules about what evidence is admissible, the role of the judge, the deliberation of the jury, this whole structure is the law's substitute for unobtainable metaphysical certainty. And think about the burden of proof in criminal cases. Beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard itself is a profound admission. It's not beyond all doubt or to absolute certainty. It explicitly acknowledges that absolute certainty is impossible and sets a high but achievable threshold for functional decision-making in the face of inherent uncertainty.
And that threshold changes depending on the context, right? Like in civil cases, it's usually just preponderance of the evidence, basically. More likely than not, 51%.
Exactly. The law adjusts its definition of sufficient proof based on the stakes and the societal need. For taking away someone's liberty, the standard is very high. For resolving a monetary dispute, a lower level of certainty is deemed functionally adequate. It's all about pragmatic compromise. The system acknowledges human perception and memory are flawed, accepts that absolute truth is elusive, and instead builds a formal process to arrive at a functional, actionable, legal truth that allows society to keep operating. It's quite an ingenious, if imperfect, solution to an impossible problem. #outro.
What a journey. We went from your grandmother's common sense being repackaged with academic jargon, testing it with the grandmother test, all the way to questioning the very fabric of reality itself. We saw how seemingly solid concepts like Dunning-Kruger might be statistical ghosts, how diagnostic labels can be inflated for profit, creating engineered realities in the clinic.
And then we dove deep into neuroscience and philosophy, finding that even our most basic perception is kind of controlled hallucination, filtered through the brain's reducing valve. We saw how this subjective reality is incredibly variable, influenced by neurochemistry, potentially leading to phenomena like seeing the seams in CGI or experiencing time differently. And the ultimate takeaway seems to be that reality, whether shaped by academic theories, marketing, or our own brains, is highly edited, highly constructed.